Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding. His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life. It's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious. Think well. Advance good. This is Q.
Well, welcome back to the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and you are in for a treat today. I know many of you know about Malcolm Gladwell. You've seen his books. You've read his books. If you haven't read his books, you've certainly been teased to buy his books on every airport bestseller shelf. He's a Canadian journalist. He lives in New York City. He's been on staff for The New Yorker since 1996 and has written best-selling books like The Tipping Point, Blink, and Outliers. He's somebody I've gotten to know on a personal level and somebody who just has so much to offer in terms of new perspective and insight that most of us just would never consider. He really applies a unique lens to understanding the challenges of our day, and he does the same thing in this Q Talk that he gave at Q Commons. And this talk was titled Legitimacy, and he helps us really understand what does it mean to actually have any kind of legitimacy, to have leadership within our communities, and how we ought to think about it. You see, many times people of faith skip over this really critical idea of legitimacy. We just assume because we have an idea or because we think we're right or because we think something's true, then therefore it should go forward. Well, Malcolm encourages us not to skip over this really important step in understanding what it means to be taken seriously, especially in our pluralistic world where people of faith are many times written off. What is it going to mean for us to live faithfully and contribute to the common good? Well, he believes it starts with legitimacy. Let's listen.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I wanted to give a special shout out to folks back home in New York City who I know are shivering in the cold, and I just wanted to remind them that here in LA it's 70 and sunny. Just wanted to rub that in a little bit. So I wanted to talk about what it means to be an effective leader in a just society. And to do that, I thought I would start with a very well-known story from the Bible, one that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, and it's the story of when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples. It happens, story's found in the Gospel of John, and it's on the eve of the Last Supper, and the disciples and Jesus all gathered together. And remember, it's Palestine, so it's incredibly dusty, and they're all wearing sandals, and so their feet are filthy. And one of the things that happened when people went to someone's home in those years is that a servant would come out with a big basin of water and wash everyone's feet. Right? It's the most menial of all jobs in that society. So what happens when all the disciples gather? Jesus takes the basin and he washes the feet of his disciples. He takes off his robe and puts on a servant's towel and gets down on his knees and performs this most menial of tasks. And Peter, as Peter would, the most volatile of all the disciples, turns to him and says, "What are you doing? I mean, you're Jesus. Why are you acting like the lowest of all servants?" And Jesus looks up to him and says, "Unless I wash you, I have no share with you." In other words, unless I do this, none of this is going to happen. This whole discipleship thing we've been discussing, it all begins with me performing this act. Now, what's he doing in that moment? Well, the standard answer and the most important answer is that he is displaying humility. And that's obviously a constant theme in the scriptures. The argument that a leader, in order to lead, must first be humble. When Jesus comes into Jerusalem for the first time, right, he rides in the back of a donkey. That's like Obama, driving around in a pickup truck. The idea is that unless you are in that state of mind, it's impossible to receive God's grace. But I want to make a slightly different argument that there's something else going on here. And it has to do with how Jesus chooses to express his power. Right? Here we have a guy who is infinitely powerful. He is the leader of what will turn out to be this extraordinary movement. At the moment, at that crucial moment, he's trying to build that movement. He's trying to get people to join him and to obey him. And how does he do that? He gets down on his knees and he washes their feet. Right? Now, I think that's an incredibly crucial point, one that we often overlook in our society as we go about the task of trying to build movements and get people to obey and join us, right? Society only works, organizations only work, businesses only work, schools only work if people join and obey. But I think we overlook this fundamental lesson when we set about trying to accomplish that task. Think about this from a sort of a theoretical standpoint. Psychologists have spent a lot of time thinking about how does that work? How is it that people choose to join and obey some kind of movement? And they come up with the notion of deterrence. And deterrence says that people obey something when the costs of disobedience are greater than the benefits. In other words, they do a kind of risk-benefit analysis in their heads, and they decide if it costs more to disobey than obey, I'm going to obey. And if it costs less to disobey than obey, I'm going to disobey. Right? And there's all kinds of evidence that are used to support this notion. And one of the most famous stories is the story of something that happened in my home country of Canada. In 1969, there's famously a police strike in the city of Montreal. For 19 hours, the police walk off the job. And in those 19 hours, there's the cost of disobedience, right? The cost of breaking the law are zero. And what happens? Montreal goes to hell in a handbasket. People go crazy. There's so many bank robberies, the banks all have to shut their doors. There's gun battles in the streets. Remember, this is Canada. People don't have guns. They must have gone to America, got guns, brought them back to Montreal just so they could shoot each other. And people look at this and they use this as evidence for why this theory of deterrence is what explains why people choose to behave in any given scenario. You know, this idea played a huge role in the criminal justice revolution of the 1990s. If you look at a state like this in California, in 1993, California passed something called the Three Strikes Law, like many states did around the United States, in which they basically said the penalties associated with breaking the law are too low. That's why people are committing crimes. So what we're going to do is we're going to dramatically increase the costs of disobedience. So California doubled the penalties on your second offense, the amount of time you would spend behind bars in your second offense. And for your third felony, regardless of what it was, the new law said you will serve 25 years to life. With the result that over the next 15 years, so many people were incarcerated in this state in California that the imprisonment rate in California was 7 times the imprisonment rate in Canada and Western Europe, right? Probably the most aggressive and draconian set of criminal punishments ever passed in the Western world. So what happened? What happened in California as a result of this? Billions of dollars were spent building prisons and hiring police and processing people through the courts. Money that could have been spent on roads or schools or healthcare was siphoned into prisons and putting people away. What was the result? Well, we've had almost 25 years to figure that question out. And the answer is nothing was the result. The best that we can tell is that California's crime rate was virtually unaffected by this extraordinarily expensive, extraordinarily draconian act, right? Crime in California declined in that period exactly the same as states in the United States who did nothing to increase their criminal penalties. Billions and billions of dollars were spent in the name of a theory of deterrence, and it didn't work, right? Let me give you another example. For the longest time, economists have been fascinated by taxes, why is it some people in some countries are more honest on tax day than others? And this is of particular relevance in the United States because taxpayers in the United States are the most honest in the world. And the question is why? Well, the theory of deterrence would say if American taxpayers are so honest, it must be because the penalties associated with cheating on your taxes are higher here than anywhere else in the world, right? That's what it would predict. So is that true? Do Americans obey the law because criminal penalties for cheating on your taxes are higher here than everyone else? No, exactly the opposite. Criminal penalties here for cheating on your taxes are the lowest in the world. Believe it or not, I know people like to demonize the IRS, but the IRS basically audits fewer tax returns than any other tax agency in the West. And the IRS almost never sends anyone to jail. You have to try really, really hard to be jailed for tax evasion, right? So that's the puzzle. Why on earth would there be such an incredible rate of obedience among Americans, even though the penalties associated with disobedience are so low? Well, looking at examples like this, psychologists have said, you know what? The theory of deterrence doesn't work. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is something more profound, and that is the notion of legitimacy. That people will obey when they feel they are being treated legitimately. Now, what does that mean? Legitimacy has three prongs. The first is respect. We believe a law or a leader to be legitimate when we feel we're treated with respect, when we feel we're listened to, when if we have a problem, we can speak up and be heard. The second prong of legitimacy is fairness. We believe we're being treated legitimately when we don't feel we're being treated any differently from our neighbors. Our neighbor's not getting some special deal that we're not getting, where the law applies equally to all. And the third principle of legitimacy is trustworthiness. We believe that the law is legitimate, or leaders are legitimate, when we feel they can be trusted, when we feel we're not going to wake up one morning and find that all the laws have been changed, or the principles under which we're being treated have been changed, when there isn't some arbitrary element to the way authority is expressed. When we feel there's trust behind the system, we'll accept that as legitimate, right? Well, now, with those three principles in mind, think back to the puzzle of why Americans pay their taxes. Why? Because our system is legitimate. As much as we complain about it, here in America, if you have a problem with your taxes and you want to speak up, will you be heard? Absolutely. In fact, one Canadian's criticism of America would be, you spend too much time listening to people who complain about their taxes in this country. It's a minor Canadian joke. The second thing is our tax system fair? Yes, it is fair, right? There's not dramatically different rules for one set of the country than the other. Pretty much the same system applies to us all. And is it trustworthy? Absolutely. The rules do not change overnight. We have a long and involved process of debate before we change any of the rules that apply to taxes. When you have those three principles in play, people will join and they will obey, and they will do so willingly. And think about three strikes. Why doesn't three strikes law work in California? Why doesn't it bring down crime? Well, maybe if you're locking up everyone in sight for 25 years to life for any felony, there were cases where people were locked up for life for stealing a slice of pizza in this state. Maybe if you do that, you destroy the legitimacy of the system. You know, I remember when I was writing my book, David and Goliath, I came across this extraordinary fact, which was that for the generation of African-American men without high school dropouts who are African-American, who were born in the 1970s, 70% of them at some point in their life have been behind bars. If you are from one of those communities and you see an entire generation of young men in prison, do you think the system will seem legitimate to you? Do you think that you can speak up and be heard? That your community is being treated as fairly as other communities? That the system is trustworthy and not arbitrary? You know, in America, we just went through this incredibly traumatic moment with Ferguson, where in a town in Missouri, after the shooting of an unarmed African-American man, the whole town rose up and rioted for weeks. Now, regardless of how you feel about whether the police acted rightly or wrongly in that town, you have to admit that it is a terribly sobering thing in America in 2015 for a town to rise up in anger against the institution that's supposed to serve and protect it. What's that about? It's about a failure of legitimacy. This notion that in crucial parts of what is considered to be one of the finest functioning democracies on earth, there is a failure of legitimacy on a local level. Or think about education. You know, an enormous amount of attention is being paid right now throughout the world in trying to increase educational opportunity in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And it has been a hard and difficult road. And the question is why? Why is it so hard? Well, maybe because at the core of that question of trying to get people from disadvantaged communities to join and obey, right? To join in the system, to participate in this whole contract that says, if you do well and work hard at school, we will reward you. Maybe at the core of that problem is a failure of legitimacy. Maybe people in disadvantaged neighborhoods stand and look at these efforts and say, I'm not being treated respectfully. No one's listening to me. Right? I'm not being treated fairly. They look at their schools, which look like prison camps, and they compare them to schools in the suburbs, which look like country clubs, and they say, there's no fairness here. And maybe they believe the system is arbitrary, right? Not trustworthy. That our ideas about how best to change education change on a whim every 6 months. And they say, I don't know what philosophy you're trying to bring to me. Now, why is this such a hard lesson for us to learn? Because it is hard, right? Why is it so much easier for us to say, for people in positions of power, to say that the way to get people to join and obey is simply for me to use my power, for me to impose my will on me, right? That's easy to do because that's the most obvious use of power. You've got authority and resources and might. You might as well use it, right? But in fact, the opposite is true. Right? True leadership begins not with leaders imposing their will, but with leaders understanding that true authority and obedience comes from the expression of legitimacy. Remember what Jesus did in one of the most crucial moments in his time on earth, right? In preparation for the Last Supper, as he is preparing to build one of the most important and powerful and world-changing movements of all time. He takes off his robe, he wraps himself in the towel of a servant. He takes a basin and he gets down on his knees and he performs the most menial of tasks. He says, I am your leader, and this is how I'm going to express my leadership, right? By getting down on my knees and listening to you, by treating you as fairly, as equally as I would treat myself, right? By being a trustworthy presence in your life and not behaving according to some arbitrary whim. And when Peter questions him, Jesus says to him with urgency, unless I do this, unless I wash you, none of this is going to work. And there is, I think, a beautiful, powerful lesson in that for all of us, that this task of bringing legitimacy to the world is an urgent one.
This is Gabe Lyons with Q, and I want to invite you to continue this conversation in person by being a part of Q Commons taking place on Thursday evening, October 13th, in communities throughout America. On this particular evening, we're bringing together key voices to help you know how to engage our divided nation. We're going to have Dr. Ravi Zacharias talking about our divided moment and what does faithfulness look like in the middle of that. We're going to also have Grammy Award-winning artist Lecrae talking about race in America. And finally, Kirsten Powers and Ross Douthat, two political commentators talking about the upcoming presidential election and how should Christians think about voting. It's sure to be an evening that's going to help you think well about what it means to bring hope and leadership to your communities at a time where divisiveness is ruling the day. So join us by learning more at qcommons.com, find the city near you, and if you don't see one in your community, host it at your church. You can learn more at qcommons.com/private simulcast. I think as we were discussing this specific concept and this idea, and we talked about religious communities, that many times you can see within faith communities that, and let's relate it specifically to Christians, that many times we can start to think our ideas because we believe they're true, that should make them legitimate. And I think what you're saying today, and I'd love for you to expound on this, that just because you have true ideas doesn't mean those ideas will be met in the populace as being true. Unless you've understood these principles.
The core notion of legitimacy is how you carry out your ideas is as important as the ideas themselves, right? So you're right. You're absolutely right. We think that because we have this beautiful set of principles that guide us, we're done. We're not. Even the most beautiful principles in the world won't work unless they're applied in a way that is that's consistent with this notion of legitimacy. So it's really process. I always think about when people get frustrated with the kind of the democratic process, for example, with the lengths that we go to check in with people and listen to them, and they say the bureaucracy takes forever and Congress, blah, blah, blah. That's part of legitimacy. You've got to listen to people if you want them to accept what you finally decide in the end. And I think that's true for communities of faith as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Malcolm, for sharing with us this evening. It's been wonderful. Let's thank Malcolm again for his time. Thank you. Well, this was classic Malcolm Gladwell, challenging us to rethink probably the way we just assume the world goes forward, the way ideas move forward, the way people respond and react to us. And I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge for Christians. It's a challenge for leaders who are trying to lead within their communities to just understand how things work. Isn't it helpful when you just kind of hear the truth and you hear how things actually work? I think it can inform us. It can inform our dialogue and conversations about ways we want to contribute to the common good and really recognize the dynamics at play around us and how we can do better at trying to contribute to all that God wants us to do in our communities to renew culture. You can always watch this talk online at qideas.org. Share it with your friends, and let's be better together. Let's stay curious, think well, and advance good.